I'm Edward Harrison, 74, a Vietnam War veteran with 3 combat tours and 2 Purple Hearts who dedicated his life to serving this country. For the past 5 years, my own grandchildren have rolled their eyes at my war stories, calling me a crazy old man living in the past, while their parents just smiled and changed the subject. Last week, everything changed when my granddaughter Sophie was doing research for her history project and stumbled across a declassified news article from 1968. The headline read, "Local Hero Saves Entire Platoon in Fierce Jungle Battle, Awarded Congressional Medal of Honor." What she discovered about her crazy grandpa would shock our entire family and change how they saw me forever. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt dismissed by your own family, hit that like button. Living in my son Marcus's house feels like being a ghost haunting my own family. Every morning, I watch from my small bedroom window as Marcus adjusts his expensive tie, checks his Rolex, and climbs into his BMW. The whole family revolves around his schedule, his needs, his successes. "Dad's got that big case today," my daughter-in-law Rebecca announces at breakfast, her voice filled with pride. The grandchildren, Sophie 16 and her younger brother Jake 14, immediately perk up, asking about the lawsuit that could make their father even more money. Meanwhile, I sit at the kitchen table with my black coffee and toast invisible. When I try to contribute to the conversation, maybe share something about my day or ask about theirs, I get polite smiles and quick topic changes. "Oh, that's nice, Grandpa," Sophie says without looking up from her phone. Jake doesn't even acknowledge I've spoken. It wasn't always like this. When Marcus was young, before Vietnam changed everything, we had a connection, but somewhere along the way, success became the only currency that mattered in this family. Marcus's law degree from Harvard hangs prominently in the living room, along with photos of him receiving various professional awards. My Purple Hearts sit in a small box in my dresser drawer, never mentioned, never displayed. The contrast becomes most painful during family gatherings. Last Christmas, I watched as relatives fawned over Marcus's latest courtroom victory while I sat in the corner recliner, forgotten. When I tried to tell my nephew about a buddy of mine from Vietnam who'd recently passed away, the conversation quickly shifted to Marcus's vacation plans to Europe. "We're so proud of him," my sister-in-law gushed. "A real success story." What hurt most was seeing that old family photo from 2019 still hanging in the hallway. Marcus stands in the center, surrounded by Rebecca and the kids, all of them beaming. I'm sitting off to the side in my chair, looking like an afterthought. Every time I pass that picture, it reminds me of my place in this family. Tolerated, not treasured. The kids' dismissiveness cuts the deepest. When I try to share stories from my service, Sophie literally rolls her eyes. "Here we go again with the war stories," she mutters to Jake, who snickers. They see me as this boring old man who won't shut up about ancient history. They don't understand that those stories aren't just memories. They're the most important moments of my life, when I mattered, when what I did made a difference. Rebecca tries to be kind, but even her kindness feels like pity. She'll pat my shoulder and say, "Why don't you rest, Edward? You've had a long day." A long day of what? Sitting around feeling useless? I'm not an invalid. I'm a man who once carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, who made split-second decisions that saved lives. But to them, I'm just an old man taking up space in their successful lives. The worst part is the silence. In this house full of people, I feel completely alone. I still remember the exact date that changed everything. March 15th, 1967. I was 22 years old, working at the Ford plant in Detroit, newly married to my beautiful Margaret, and Marcus was just 8 months old. The draft notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, official government letterhead that felt heavier than paper should. Margaret was feeding Marcus his breakfast when I opened it, and I watched her face crumble as she read the words over my shoulder. "You have been selected for induction into the Armed Forces of the United States." Margaret started crying immediately, bouncing Marcus on her hip as tears streamed down her cheeks. "They can't take you," she whispered. "You have a family, you have a baby." But we both knew they could, and they would. The Vietnam War was consuming young men like a hungry beast, and I was just another meal. The thing is, I wasn't angry about being drafted. Maybe I should have been, but I wasn't. I loved my country, believed in what we were fighting for, even if I didn't fully understand the politics of it all. My father had served in World War II, came home with stories of honor and duty, of fighting for something bigger than himself. I wanted to make him proud, wanted to prove I had that same courage running through my veins. The night before I left, Margaret and I sat on our small apartment's fire escape, watching the city lights twinkle below us. Marcus was asleep in his crib, completely unaware that his daddy was about to disappear for God knew how long. "Promise me you'll come back," Margaret said, gripping my hand so tight her knuckles went white. "Promise me you'll be careful." I made that promise, sealing it with a kiss that tasted like salt from her tears. I had no idea how hard it would be to keep. Basic training at Fort Benning was brutal but manageable. I was young, strong, and motivated. I excelled at marksmanship, earned respect from my drill sergeants, and made friends with guys from all over the country. We were all scared, but we were scared together, and that made it bearable. I wrote to Margaret every day, telling her about my training, about the guys in my unit, about how much I missed her and Marcus, but nothing could have prepared me for stepping off that transport plane in Saigon in August 1967. The heat hit me like a physical force, thick and suffocating, carrying smells I'd never experienced. Diesel. Fuel mixed with exotic spices, sewage, and something else I couldn't identify, but would later learn, was the scent of a country at war. I was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, part of a platoon that would become my brothers in every sense of the word. There was Tommy Rodriguez from Texas, who could make anyone laugh even in the worst circumstances. Jimmy Chen from San Francisco, barely 18 and homesick for his mother's cooking. Big Mike Sullivan from Boston, who looked out for all of us like we were his little brothers. We were all just kids, really, thrown into a war we barely understood, fighting for a cause that seemed both vital and mysterious. But we had each other, and we had duty, and for a young man raised on stories of heroism, that felt like enough. The Vietnamese jungle was a living nightmare that Hollywood could never capture. Every step was a gamble, every shadow a potential enemy, every sound a reason to freeze and listen for your life. The humidity made your clothes stick to your skin like a second layer, and the insects, God, the insects were relentless. Mosquitoes the size of small birds, leeches that found their way into places you didn't know existed, and spiders that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. But it wasn't the environment that broke most men. It was watching your brothers die. I kept a field journal throughout my first tour, writing in it whenever we had a moment of relative safety. The pages are stained with blood, mud, and tears, a record of hell that I've never shown anyone. The first entry that still haunts me was dated September 12th, 1967. Lost Rodriguez today, stepped on a mine while we were on patrol. 1 second. He was joking about his girl back home. The next, he was gone. Just gone. How do I write to his family? How do I explain that their Tommy, who made us all laugh, even when we wanted to cry, died in a jungle on the other side of the world fighting for people who might never know his name? The worst part was how quickly death became normal. After Rodriguez, we lost Chen to sniper fire. Big Mike took shrapnel from a mortar attack and bled out before we could get him to a medic. One by one, the guys I'd shared stories and dreams with were shipped home in boxes. New faces arrived to replace them, younger and more scared than we'd been, and the cycle continued. I developed a reputation in those early months. While other soldiers focused on staying alive, which was smart, I couldn't leave anyone behind. If someone got wounded, I went for them. If someone got separated from the unit, I found them. It wasn't heroics. It was something deeper than that. These guys were my family, closer to me than anyone back home could understand. We'd seen each other at our worst, held each other when the fear got too strong, shared our last cigarettes. And our deepest fears. Lieutenant Morrison noticed my instincts early on. "Harrison," he said after I'd carried a wounded soldier half a mile through enemy territory, "you've got something special. You don't panic when everything goes to hell. You think clearly when other men freeze up." He recommended me for squad leader, even though I was younger than most of the guys I'd be leading. The nightmares started during that first tour. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced I could still hear Rodriguez calling for help. The other guys understood. We all had our demons. But I learned to push through it, to focus on the mission and my men. There was no time for weakness, no luxury of falling apart. My journal entry from December 1967 reads, "Home for Christmas leave in 2 weeks. Don't know how to act normal around people who haven't seen what we've seen. How do you make small talk? When you've watched children die? How do you complain about cold coffee when you've gone days without food?" Margaret's letters are full of love and excitement about me coming home, but I feel like I'm already a different person than the man she married. The leave was harder than I expected. Everything seemed too bright, too loud, too safe. Margaret tried to understand, but how could she? I couldn't tell her about the things I'd done, the things I'd seen. Instead, I held Marcus and marveled at how much he'd grown, tried to be the husband and father they deserved, and counted the days until I had to return to the only place that made sense anymore, back to my brothers in the jungle. When I volunteered for a second tour, Margaret cried for 3 days, but she understood in her way. "Those boys need you," she said finally. "I can see it in your letters. They need someone like you watching out for them." She was right. They did need me, and I needed them. April 7, 1968. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. We were on a reconnaissance mission near the Cambodian border. 13 men, including myself, moving through dense jungle, following intelligence reports of enemy supply routes. I was the squad leader by then, responsible for 12 other soldiers who trusted me to bring them home alive. The torn tactical map I carried that day still sits in my dresser drawer, marked with coordinates that changed my life forever. The ambush happened at 0347 hours. We were crossing a small clearing, the kind of open space that made every soldier nervous when the jungle exploded around us. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks, and the distinctive crack of AK-47s filled the air. "Contact! Contact!" Someone screamed into the radio, but it was barely audible over the chaos. Within seconds, I assessed our situation, and it was bad. We were caught in a classic L-shaped ambush, enemy positions on 2 sides, creating a devastating crossfire. Men dove for whatever cover they could find. Fallen logs, termite mounds, shallow depressions in the earth. But the cover was sparse, and the enemy fire was intense and disciplined. These weren't inexperienced fighters. This was a well-planned trap. "Harrison!" Private Jackson called out from behind a tree about 30 yards to my left. "Williams is hit bad, real bad." I could see Williams lying in the open, blood pooling beneath him, trying to crawl toward cover but not making it. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly. Anyone who moved to help him would be cut down instantly. That's when I saw the real problem. We weren't just caught in an ambush. We were being herded. The enemy fire was driving us toward what I realized was a secondary position, probably with more fighters waiting to finish us off. If we retreated the way they wanted us to, we'd all die. If we stayed where we were, Williams would bleed out, and we'd eventually be overrun. The decision I made in that moment goes against everything they teach you in tactical training. Instead of calling for backup or trying to organize a coordinated retreat, I did something that everyone, including me, knew was suicide. I stood up and ran directly into the enemy fire. I zigzagged through the clearing, drawing their attention and their bullets, making myself the primary target while screaming for my men to move. "Go, go! Get Williams and move!" The world slowed down around me as bullets whined past my head, so close I could feel the displacement of air. One caught my shoulder, spinning me around, but I kept moving. I reached Williams first, grabbed him under the arms, and started dragging him toward better cover. He was unconscious, blood everywhere, and heavy as dead weight. The enemy concentrated their fire on me, which was exactly what I wanted. While they were shooting at me, my men could move, could return fire, could start fighting back instead of just surviving. That's when the second phase of my plan kicked in. As I dragged Williams to safety, I was also memorizing the enemy muzzle. Flashes, counting positions, identifying their firing patterns. When I got Williams behind a substantial log, I grabbed his M16 and my own and started returning fire with deadly precision. "Suppressing fire on my mark," I yelled to my squad. "We're going to advance by fire and movement." It was insane. Standard. Doctrine said we should call in artillery or air support, wait for reinforcement. But Williams was dying, and I could see other men were hit too. We didn't have time for standard doctrine. For the next 45 minutes, I led my squad in a methodical assault on a superior enemy force. We moved from cover to cover, each movement coordinated, each advance covered by precise suppressing fire. I took 2 more hits, one in the thigh that went clean through, another that grazed my ribs, but I kept moving, kept leading, kept making decisions that somehow kept us alive. By the time the dust settled, we had not only survived the ambush, but eliminated the entire enemy position. 12 American soldiers walked out of that jungle alive because of decisions made in the space of heartbeats. The after-action report would later count 37 enemy dead and wounded against our 1 KIA. Williams died from his wounds despite everything I did to save him. But what I remember most wasn't the tactical victory or the enemy body count. It was the look in my men's eyes as we waited for medevac. Respect, gratitude, and something deeper. The recognition that I had been willing to die for them and that my choices had brought them home to their families. My discharge papers from November 1969 tell only part of the story. Combat-related injuries, shrapnel wounds, bullet wounds, psychological trauma. What they don't capture is how I felt stepping off that plane at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, looking for Margaret and Marcus in a crowd of faces that seemed impossibly clean and innocent. Margaret ran to me, tears streaming down her face, and threw her arms around me so hard it hurt my still healing wounds. Marcus, now 3 years old, hung back shyly, unsure of this stranger who was supposed to be his father. I'd missed 2.5 years of his life. His first steps, his first words, countless bedtime stories and morning hugs. The guilt of that absence hit me harder than any enemy bullet. The nightmares started immediately. Every night I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced I was back in that jungle clearing. Margaret would try to comfort me, but how could I explain what I was seeing behind my closed eyelids? Rodriguez calling for help, Williams bleeding out despite everything I'd done. The faces of enemy soldiers I'd killed up close enough to see their eyes. In 1969, they didn't have a name for what I was experiencing. The doctors at the VA hospital called it combat fatigue or soldier's heart, prescribed some pills, and sent me home with instructions to readjust to civilian life. They treated the physical wounds, the scars on my shoulder, thigh, and ribs, but nobody knew how to treat the invisible ones. I tried to find work that matched my leadership. Experience from the military, but civilian employers looked at my discharge papers and saw problems, not qualifications. "We're looking for someone more stable," one manager said, after I'd had a minor panic attack during the interview. Another told me bluntly, "We don't hire head cases." Eventually, I took a job at a construction company. Hard physical labor that paid by the hour. The work was honest and I was grateful for it, but it was a far cry from the responsibility I'd carried in Vietnam. I went from making life and death decisions that affected dozens of men to mixing concrete and hauling materials. My foreman was younger than me, had never served, and treated me like just another grunt worker. Margaret tried to understand, but the man who came home wasn't the same one who'd left. I couldn't sleep next to her. Too many nightmares, too much. Thrashing around. I moved to the couch, then eventually to the spare bedroom. Intimacy became impossible. How could I explain that sudden movements or unexpected touches made me reach for weapons that weren't there? The drinking started as self-medication. A beer or two after work to quiet the memories, then a six-pack, then whiskey when beer wasn't strong enough. Margaret found me passed out at the kitchen table one morning, empty bottle beside me, Marcus asking, "Mommy, why is Daddy sleeping in his food?" The worst part was watching my family learn to walk on eggshells around me. Marcus would approach cautiously, afraid his father might explode without warning. Margaret started speaking in the gentle, careful tone people use around mental patients. They loved me, but they were also afraid of me, and I hated myself for making them feel that way. When Marcus was in elementary school, his teacher asked him to write about his father for Father's Day. He brought the paper home, proud of his work. "My daddy is sad a lot. He has bad dreams and sometimes he yells, but Mommy says he's a hero. I don't know what that means." Reading those innocent words broke something inside me that I've never been able to fully repair. The family dynamics shifted during those early years. Marcus learned to go to his mother for everything: comfort, guidance, celebration. I became the unpredictable element in the household, the one they had to manage rather than rely on. Success became defined by Margaret's steady job at the school, district and Marcus's academic achievements, my service, my sacrifice, my medals hidden in the dresser drawer. None of that mattered in the daily reality of suburban life. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March 1975, 6 years after I'd come home. Official White House letterhead, marked confidential, in red stamps across the envelope. Margaret found it in our mailbox and brought it to me with trembling hands. "Edward, what is this? Are you in trouble?" Inside was an invitation. No, a summons. To a classified ceremony at the Pentagon. "Sergeant Edward Harrison," it read. "You are hereby requested to attend a presentation ceremony on April 15th, 1975, at 1400 hours. Due to ongoing national security considerations, this ceremony is classified, and you are instructed not to discuss the nature of this event with anyone not holding appropriate security clearance." I had no idea what it meant. Margaret pressed me for details, but I genuinely didn't know. "Maybe it's about my disability benefits," I told her, though something in my gut said it was much bigger than that. The day of the ceremony, I took a bus to Washington, D.C., wearing the only suit I owned, the same one I'd worn to my wedding. The Pentagon was intimidating, all concrete and authority, guards who checked and rechecked my identification before, escorting me through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. I was led to a small, windowless room, where 5 other Vietnam veterans sat in folding chairs, all of us looking confused and nervous. We didn't talk much. Years of military training had taught us when to keep quiet. An officer I didn't recognize entered and asked us to follow him to another room, this one more formal, with flags and portraits of military leaders on the walls. That's when General Morrison walked in. Not my old Lieutenant Morrison, but a full general whose chest was covered with ribbons and medals. Behind him came a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as being from the Department of Defense. And finally, a Marine colonel carrying a wooden box that made my heart start racing. "Gentlemen," General Morrison began, "you are here today because of classified actions you took during your service in Southeast Asia. Due to the sensitive nature of these operations and ongoing intelligence concerns, the recognition you earned has been delayed. Today, we correct that oversight." He called my name first. "Sergeant Edward Harrison, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States while serving with the 1st Infantry Division near the Cambodian border on April 7, 1968. The words that followed described the firefight I'd lived through, but they sounded different coming from him, clinical, official, almost unreal. Your actions in single-handedly drawing enemy fire while rescuing wounded personnel, then leading a successful counter-assault against superior forces, directly resulted in saving the lives of 12 American servicemen. For this action, you are awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration presented by the United States of America. The room went completely silent. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The Medal of Honor, the medal that legends received, that heroes from history books earned, not construction workers with PTSD and drinking problems. The citation continued with details I'd tried to forget: the tactical situation, the enemy strength, the casualties avoided because of my actions. When General Morrison placed that blue ribbon around my neck, the weight of the medal seemed to anchor me to the floor. "Sergeant Harrison," he said quietly, for my ears only, "what you did that day embodied the highest traditions of military service. Your country is grateful." Then came the explanation that would haunt me for decades. The man in the dark suit stepped forward and spoke in the tone of someone delivering bad news. "Due to ongoing intelligence operations and the sensitive nature of the mission you were supporting, this award is classified at the highest levels. You cannot discuss this ceremony or this recognition with anyone lacking appropriate security clearance. This includes family members, friends, employers, and other veterans." I stared at him, not understanding. "I can't tell my wife?" "I'm afraid not. The operations you supported are still classified, and revealing this award could compromise ongoing intelligence activities. You will receive official documentation, but it must be kept secure. Violation of this classification could result in federal prosecution." They gave me a folder with the official citation, signed by the president, along with stern warnings about secrecy. I rode the bus home in a daze, the medal hidden in my jacket pocket, carrying the highest honor my country could bestow, and unable to share it with the people who mattered most. That night, Margaret asked how my appointment had gone. I looked into her eyes, this woman who'd stood by me through nightmares and drinking and years of difficult readjustment, and lied. "Just routine paperwork," I said. "Nothing important." The medal went into the box with my purple hearts, hidden away like a shameful secret instead of the recognition I'd dreamed of receiving. Marcus was brilliant. There was never any doubt about that. While I struggled with basic civilian readjustment, my son excelled at everything he touched. Honor roll every semester, debate team captain, student body president. Margaret and I would sit in the audience at his award ceremonies, and I'd feel this complex mixture of pride and inadequacy watching him accept recognition after recognition. "Your son has exceptional potential," his high school guidance counselor told us during a college planning meeting. Harvard, Yale, Princeton. He could get into any of them. Margaret beamed with pride, squeezing my hand under the table. I smiled and nodded, but inside I was calculating the cost. Even with financial aid, the expenses would be enormous on a construction worker's salary. What Marcus never knew was that I'd been quietly saving every extra penny from my VA disability payments for his education. The money I got for my combat, injuries, for the nightmares and flashbacks that still woke me up screaming, I put it all into a college fund. While my family saw me as the broken veteran struggling to hold down a job, I was actually planning for Marcus's future in the only way I could. When he got accepted to Harvard Law School, the celebration lasted for days. Friends, neighbors, and extended family all came by to congratulate him. "The first college graduate in the family," Margaret announced proudly, "and Harvard Law School." The unspoken comparison was obvious. While his father had amounted to nothing more than manual labor and war trauma, Marcus was going to be somebody important. I helped him move into his dormitory that first semester, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs while he chatted excitedly with his new roommate about classes and professors. Walking across Harvard Yard, surrounded by all that history and prestige, I felt proud, but also profoundly out of place. These were the kinds of Institutions that produce leaders, decision-makers, people who mattered. I was just the working-class father who'd paid the bills. During his law school years, I worked overtime whenever possible to help with expenses. Double shifts, weekend work, holiday pay, anything to ease the financial burden. When Marcus called, home stressed about money for books or living expenses, I'd quietly transfer funds from my own meager savings. Margaret would ask how we could afford it, and I'd mumble something about extra work or overtime pay. The truth was, I was using the back pay from my classified Medal of Honor. Military records showed additional compensation for my special assignment. Money I could access without explaining its source. So in a twisted way, the medal I couldn't tell anyone about was funding my son's education at America's most prestigious law school. Marcus graduated magna cum laude, passed the bar exam on his first try, and landed a position at a top firm in Detroit. The starting salary was more than I'd ever made in my best year of construction work. At his graduation party, everyone toasted his success, his hard work, his bright future. I stood in the corner, proud but invisible, watching my son become everything I'd never been able to be. The distance between us grew wider as his success mounted. He'd call home with stories about important cases, famous clients, professional achievements that were light years beyond my understanding. I'd try to connect, to ask meaningful questions, but my lack of education and professional experience made meaningful conversation difficult. Dad just doesn't get it, I overheard him telling Margaret one day. He means well, but he doesn't understand. The pressure I'm under, the complexity of what I do. He wasn't being cruel, he was just stating what seemed obvious to him. His old man, the construction worker with PTSD, couldn't relate to the sophisticated world of high-stakes litigation. When he got married to Rebecca, a woman from a wealthy family with connections in politics and business, the class differences became even more pronounced. Their wedding was elegant, expensive, everything that Marcus deserved. I walked him down the aisle in a rented tuxedo, trying not to feel like an imposter among all the successful, educated guests. Rebecca was kind to me, but in the way educated people are kind to service workers, polite, appreciative, but clearly from a different world. She'd ask about my work at the construction company with genuine interest, but I could see in her eyes that she viewed me as one of life's unfortunate characters, someone to be pitied rather than respected. As Marcus's career soared, our relationship settled into a pattern of polite distance. He was dutiful, called regularly, visited for holidays, made sure I was financially okay. But the man who'd once been my little boy, who'd sat on my lap listening to carefully edited stories about my military service, had grown into someone who saw me as a burden to be managed rather than a father to be celebrated. Sophie was 12 when she wrote the essay that broke my heart. Her teacher had assigned the class to write about a family member, and she chose me not out of admiration, but because she thought I'd be the easiest subject. The essay was titled, "My Boring Grandfather," and Marcus proudly showed it to me, completely missing the pain it caused. My grandfather Edward is 68 years old, and he used to be in a war, it began. He talks about it all the time, even though it was like a million years ago. He tells the same stories over and over about his friends who died and places with weird names I can't pronounce. Mom says I should listen politely, but honestly, it's really boring. All old people talk about the same stuff, how things were different when they were young and how hard everything was back then. She went on to describe me as someone who sits around all day and complains about his back hurting and watches old war movies that are stupid and too loud. The essay concluded, "I love my grandpa, but I wish he had more interesting hobbies like playing video games or something cool like that." Her teacher had written "good observation skills" in red ink at the top. Marcus and Rebecca laughed when they read it. "Kids are so honest," Rebecca said, ruffling Sophie's hair. She really captured Grandpa's personality. The mockery became more obvious as the grandchildren got older. Sophie, now 16, would literally roll her eyes when I started to share a memory from Vietnam. "Oh God, not another war story," she'd mutter to her younger brother Jake, who would smirk and make exaggerated yawning sounds. They'd developed a whole repertoire of subtle cruelties, checking their phones when I spoke, exchanging glances that said, "Here he goes again," physically turning away when I tried to engage them in conversation. The technology gap made everything worse. They lived in a world of smartphones, social media, and instant everything, while I struggled to understand basic cable television. When I'd try to connect with them about their interests, asking about their games or their friends, I could see the impatience in their faces. To them, I was hopelessly outdated, a relic from a time they couldn't imagine and didn't want to understand. "Grandpa, you wouldn't get it," became Sophie's standard response to any attempt at conversation. "It's like a generational thing." Jake was even more direct. "Why don't you just watch your old movies and leave us alone?" The worst incident happened last Thanksgiving. I was trying to tell them about my buddy Tommy Rodriguez, how he'd been only 19 when he died, how he'd planned to become a teacher when he got home. I thought maybe they could relate. Tommy had been close to their age when he'd made the ultimate sacrifice for his country. "Can we please talk about something else?" Sophie interrupted. "These war stories are so depressing. And why do they all end with someone dying? Don't you have any happy memories?" Jake laughed. "Yeah, Grandpa, lighten up. It's Thanksgiving, not Memorial Day." I sat there, stung, while Marcus and Rebecca said nothing. They didn't correct their children or defend me. If anything, they seemed relieved that someone had finally said what they'd all been thinking. The conversation quickly moved to Sophie's college applications and Jake's basketball season, topics that mattered, modern achievements that deserved attention. Later that evening, I overheard Jake on the phone with a friend. "Yeah, my grandfather is staying with us. He's kind of weird. All he talks about is this war from like 50 years ago. It's super annoying. My dad says we have to be nice to him because he's old and sad, but honestly, I just try to avoid him." That conversation haunted me for weeks. Old and sad. That's how my own grandson saw me. Not as a man who'd served his country with honor, who'd saved lives and earned the highest military decoration America could offer. Just a pathetic old man to be tolerated out of pity. The rejection from my grandchildren hurt worse than any physical wound I'd received in combat. In Vietnam, I'd been needed. Men had looked to me for leadership, trusted me with their lives, respected my judgment. Now my own family saw me as an irrelevant bore, whose stories were nothing more than annoying interruptions to their important modern lives. I stopped trying to share my memories after that. When the grandchildren visited, I'd retreat to my room or find excuses to run errands. It was easier than watching them check their phones while I spoke. Easier than seeing the relief in their faces when I finally stopped talking. But the silence was its own kind of death, watching the most important experiences of my life dismissed as boring stories from a crazy old man. Margaret died on a Tuesday in October 2019, 3 months after her cancer diagnosis. She'd hidden the symptoms for weeks, not wanting to worry anyone, not wanting to be a burden. By the time she finally agreed to see a doctor, it was too late for anything but palliative care. Those final months brought us closer than we'd been. In years, the woman who'd lived with my nightmares, my drinking, my decades of struggle with invisible wounds, faced her own mortality with a grace that humbled me. We talked more during her illness than we had in the previous 5 years combined. "I should have understood better," she whispered one evening as I sat beside her hospital bed. "The war never really ended for you, did it? You've been fighting it all these years, and I thought you were just difficult." I held her hand, so thin now, so fragile. I never knew how to explain it. How do you tell someone you love that you see dead friends every time you close your eyes? That sometimes you wake up and for a moment you're still 22 and terrified in a jungle on the other side of the world? Her last letter to me, written in the hospice when she was too weak to speak clearly, is the most precious thing I own. In shaky handwriting, she wrote, "Edward, you are not the broken man you think you are. You are the bravest person I've ever known. Not because of what you did in the war, though I'm sure it was extraordinary, but because of how you've lived. Every day since, fighting your demons, taking care of your family, never giving up even when everything seemed hopeless. I wish I had told you more often how proud I am to be your wife. Please don't let the sadness win. You have so much more to give." After the funeral, the loneliness was overwhelming. 47 years of marriage, gone. The house we'd shared felt empty and too quiet. Every room held memories. The kitchen where she'd made my coffee every morning, the living room where we'd watched our old shows together, the bedroom where she'd comforted me through countless nightmares. Marcus offered to help me sort through her belongings, but I couldn't bear it. Her clothes still smelled like her perfume. Her books still had bookmarks where she'd stopped reading. Her coffee cup still sat in the sink from that last morning when she'd felt well enough to have breakfast. The practical realities were overwhelming too. Margaret had handled all the household finances, the insurance paperwork, the social obligations. Suddenly, I was responsible for things I'd never learned to manage. Bills came in her name. Friends called, asking about arrangements I didn't understand. The world expected me to function normally when I felt like half of myself had been buried. With her, Marcus approached me 6 weeks after the funeral. "Dad, Rebecca and I have been talking. This house is too big for you now, and honestly, we're worried about you being alone. Why don't you come stay with us? We have the spare room, and it would be good for the kids to spend more time with their grandfather." I knew it was practical. I knew it made sense. But I also knew what it really meant. I was becoming the elderly parent who needed to be watched, managed, cared for like a child. The independent life I'd built was over. Moving into Marcus's house was harder than I'd expected. Everything was different. The sounds, the smells, the rhythms of daily life. Rebecca tried to make me comfortable, but it was clear I was disrupting their established routines. Suddenly, there was an old man at their breakfast table watching their evening television programs, occupying space in their busy lives. The grandchildren were polite but distant. They'd grown up knowing me as the occasional visitor who told boring war stories. Now I was a permanent fixture, a reminder of death and aging in their young, vibrant household. Sophie was busy with her junior year of high school, college applications, and social activities. Jake had basketball and friends and teenage concerns. I was just another adult obligation in their already complicated lives. The worst part was the silence at night. In my own house, the quiet had been filled with Margaret's presence. The sound of her breathing, the rustle of her turning book pages, the familiar creaks and sighs of a home we'd shared for decades. In Marcus's house, the silence was foreign and complete. I'd lie awake in the spare room, staring at the ceiling, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt, even in the jungle. Margaret's death had taken away the last person who truly knew me, who remembered the young man I'd been before the war changed everything. Now I was just the elderly father-in-law, living in the spare room, the one who needed to be checked on and managed and politely included in family activities. Without her as my anchor, I drifted further away from any sense of purpose or belonging, becoming more invisible with each passing day. Sophie came home from school on a Monday in late March with an assignment that would change everything. She flopped down at the kitchen table where I was reading the newspaper and pulled out her laptop with the dramatic sigh that only 16-year-olds can perfect. "I have this stupid history project due next week," she announced to the room in general. "We have to research an unsung hero from the Vietnam War and write a paper about their contributions. It's supposed to be someone who didn't get proper recognition or something." Rebecca looked up from making dinner. "That sounds interesting. Honey, any ideas who you want to research?" Sophie rolled her eyes. "Not really. Everyone's going to do the obvious ones, some pilot or nurse or whatever. Mrs. Peterson said we should try to find someone local if possible, but how am I supposed to find some random Vietnam veteran who lives around here?" I cleared my throat from my corner of the table. "Well, I served in Vietnam. I could tell you about some of the men I knew who— No offense, Grandpa, Sophie interrupted without looking up from her laptop, but I need someone actually heroic. This is for a grade. The words hit me like a physical blow. Rebecca shot Sophie. A sharp look. Sophie Marie, that was incredibly rude. Apologize to your grandfather right now. I didn't mean it like that, Sophie said, finally glancing at me with mild embarrassment. I just meant like someone famous, someone with documentation and stuff, not just, regular stories. Regular stories. That's what my service had become to my own granddaughter. Regular stories from a regular old man who'd done regular things in a war she couldn't understand or appreciate. It's fine, I said quietly, folding my newspaper. I understand what you need, but Sophie's assignment sheet left on the table when she went upstairs caught my attention. The requirements were specific. Students must research a Vietnam War veteran who demonstrated exceptional courage or made significant contributions that were not widely recognized. Use primary sources including military records, newspaper articles, and official documentation. Personal interviews alone are not sufficient. Primary sources, official documentation. The irony was almost funny. If Sophie only knew what was sitting in a box in my dresser drawer upstairs. Documentation that would blow her mind. Official records that would make her the envy of every student in her class. But that documentation was classified, forbidden, locked away behind government secrecy that had lasted over 50 years. That evening, I listened to Sophie complaining to her mother about the assignment. I've been searching online for hours, and I can't find anyone interesting. All the websites have the same people, the same pilots, the same medics, the same stories everyone already knows about. How am I supposed to find some hidden hero who lives locally? It's impossible. Have you tried the library? Rebecca suggested. Maybe there are local newspaper archives or— Mum, it's 2024. If it's not online, it doesn't exist, Sophie replied with the confidence of someone who'd never lived in a world without the internet. Jake wandered into the kitchen during this conversation. Why don't you just make someone up? Like, who's going to check? Because Mrs. Peterson said she's going to verify all our sources, Sophie said. She's super strict about that stuff. Plus, I actually want to do well on this. It's worth like 20% of our final grade. I sat in my chair, invisible as always, listening to my granddaughter struggle with a problem I could solve in minutes. I had everything she needed: first-hand accounts, official documentation, a story of genuine heroism that would earn her an A+, and maybe even some kind of recognition from her teacher. But the classification of my Medal of Honor made it impossible to help her. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Here was Sophie desperately searching for an unsung hero, while one sat 10 feet away from her, dismissed as irrelevant. She was looking for someone extraordinary while living with someone who'd earned the highest military honor America could bestow. But government secrecy and family indifference had combined to make me invisible, even to my own blood. Later that night, I heard Sophie on a video call with her friends, all of them complaining about the same assignment. My grandfather was in Vietnam, she told them, but he's just like a regular guy, not hero material or anything. I need someone actually important. Not hero material. The words echoed in my head as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The granddaughter who carried my blood, who bore my family name, who lived under the same roof, had no idea that she was related to someone who'd risked everything to save 12 men's lives. Someone whose actions had been deemed worthy of the nation's highest honor. But how could she know? For 50 years, I'd been forced to hide the most important moment of my life, the defining act that separated me from ordinary men. The classification had not only stolen my recognition, it had stolen my family's ability to know who I really was. Sophie spent the entire weekend hunched over her laptop, growing more frustrated with each passing hour. I watched her from my usual spot at the kitchen table, occasionally offering to help, only to be politely dismissed each time. By Sunday evening, she was near tears. "This is hopeless," she announced to the family during dinner. "I've searched every database, every archive, every military website I can find. There are no unsung heroes from around here, at least none that I can actually write about with real sources." Marcus set down his fork. "Honey, maybe you're being too specific. What if you expanded your search area?" "Dad," Mrs. Peterson specifically said to focus on local connections if possible. "She wants us to understand that heroism happened everywhere, not just in famous battles that made it into textbooks." Sophie pushed her food around her plate. "I'm going to have to pick some random guy from the internet and hope I can find enough information." That night, unable to sleep, Sophie decided to try one more approach. Instead of searching for Vietnam or heroes, she started looking for declassified military documents, thinking maybe she could find something that had recently been made public. She'd learned in her AP government class that military records were sometimes declassified decades after the fact. At 11:47 p.m., she stumbled across a database of recently declassified Vietnam War citations and awards. Most of the entries were routine Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, commendations that had been classified for procedural reasons rather than security concerns. She was about to give up when she decided to search by location, entering Michigan and Detroit to see if anything local came up. The search returned 7 results. The first 5 were unremarkable. The 6th made her heart skip a beat. Harrison Edward J., Congressional Medal of Honor, classified 1975, declassified 2023. She stared at the screen, sure she was misreading. Harrison was her last name. Edward was her grandfather's name. But Congressional Medal of Honor? That was impossible. That was the highest military decoration in the country, reserved for the most extraordinary acts of heroism. Her boring grandfather, who told repetitive war stories, couldn't possibly be the same person. She clicked on the entry, and her world tilted. There, in official military documentation, was her grandfather's full name, rank, unit, and a detailed citation describing actions that sounded like something from a movie. The language was formal, military, but the story it told was incredible. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as squad leader with Company B, 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry, Regiment 1st Infantry Division, in action against enemy forces near the Cambodian border on the 7th April 1968. Sophie read the citation 3 times, her hands shaking. The document described how her grandfather had single-handedly drawn enemy fire to save wounded soldiers, then led a counterattack against overwhelming odds. 12 men had lived because of his actions. 12 families got their sons, husbands, and fathers back because Edward Harrison had been willing to die for them. The citation was signed by the President of the United States. The date was 1975, but stamped across the top were the words "Classified National Security," and below that, much more recent, "Declassified." 15th of March, 2023. Sophie's mind raced. This had been classified for almost 50 years. Why? And more. Importantly, why had her grandfather never mentioned it? She'd spent years dismissing his war stories as boring reminiscences from a sad old man when he was actually a genuine American hero. She opened a new browser tab and searched for Congressional Medal of Honor recipients. The statistics were staggering. Since the medal's creation, fewer than 3,500 people had received it. During the entire Vietnam War, only 258 medals were awarded. Many were given posthumously. Her grandfather was one of fewer than 260 living people to have earned the nation's highest military honor. The more she read, the more ashamed she felt. The Congressional Medal of Honor wasn't just another military decoration. It was reserved for actions so extraordinary, so far beyond normal duty, that they defied belief. Recipients were entitled to special recognition, benefits, and honor. For life, They were American legends, and she'd been calling him a boring old man. Sophie printed out the entire citation, along with several pages of information about the Medal of Honor and its significance. Her hands were still shaking as she read through everything again, trying to reconcile the heroic figure described in these documents with the quiet, overlooked man who lived down the hall. She found a newspaper clipping from 1968, recently digitized and uploaded to a military archive. The headline read, "Local Hero Saves Entire Platoon in Fierce Jungle Battle, Awarded Congressional Medal of Honor." The article described the action in detail, calling her grandfather's actions an extraordinary display of courage that exemplifies the highest traditions of military service. But if this had happened in 1968 and the medal was awarded in 1975, why was it classified? Sophie searched for information about classified military awards and found references to operations that were deemed sensitive for national security reasons. Some medals were classified to protect ongoing intelligence operations or to prevent enemy forces from learning about successful American tactics. The declassification notice indicated that the restriction had been lifted due to the passage of sufficient time and the conclusion of related intelligence operations. After 50 years, her grandfather was finally free to discuss his Medal of Honor, if he wanted to. Sophie sat in her dark bedroom, staring at the printed documents spread across her desk. Her boring grandfather, the man she'd dismissed and avoided, the regular guy she'd told her friends wasn't hero material, was actually one of the most decorated soldiers in American history, and she'd been too young and too ignorant to see it. Sophie didn't sleep that night. Instead, she dove deeper into researching her grandfather, driven by a mixture of excitement, shame, and desperate curiosity. She had access to her school's premium research databases, and she used every resource available to piece together the full picture of Edward Harrison's military service. The official military records were extensive once she knew where to look. Her grandfather had served 3 tours in Vietnam, not the couple years she'd always assumed. His service record showed multiple commendations, 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat, a Bronze Star with V device for valor, a Silver Star for gallantry in action, and finally, the Congressional Medal of Honor that had been hidden for half a century. The medical records were the hardest to read. They documented injuries that were far more serious than she'd realized. Shrapnel wounds, bullet wounds, psychological trauma that was described in clinical terms that didn't capture the human cost. One entry noted severe combat stress reaction and recurring nightmares. Another mentioned difficulty with civilian readjustment and hypervigilance consistent with combat trauma. Sophie felt sick reading these documents. All those times she'd rolled her eyes when her grandfather seemed jumpy or distant. All those moments when she'd been annoyed by his weird behavior. He'd been dealing with wounds that went far deeper than the physical scars she'd occasionally glimpsed. She found a digitized copy of his original draft notice from 1967. 22 years old, married with a baby. He hadn't volunteered for the war. He'd been drafted, pulled away from his young family to serve his country. The contrast between that young man's life and what he'd endured was staggering, but it was the witness statements from other soldiers that really brought the story to life. The military archive contained sworn statements from the men her grandfather had saved, written as part of the Medal of Honor nomination process. These weren't clinical military reports. They were personal accounts from men who owed their lives to Edward Harrison. Sergeant Michael Torres wrote, "I was wounded and lying in the open when the shooting started. Harrison ran straight into enemy fire to drag me to safety. I watched him take at least 2 hits while he was pulling me behind cover. He saved my life and the lives of 11 other men that day. I've never seen courage like that before or since." Private. First Class David Kim's statement was even more detailed. "When the ambush started, we were pinned down and taking heavy casualties. Harrison made a decision that seemed like suicide. He stood up and ran directly at the enemy positions, drawing their fire while screaming for us to move. He coordinated our counterattack while bleeding from multiple wounds. Without his leadership, we all would have died in that clearing. There were 12 such statements, each one describing her grandfather's actions from a different perspective, each one painting a picture of extraordinary heroism under impossible circumstances. These men had written these statements in 1968, when the memories were fresh, when the gratitude was overwhelming. Sophie found contact information for 3 of the survivors who were still alive. With her heart pounding, she composed an email explaining who she was and asking if they remembered her grandfather. The response from Michael Torres came within hours. "Sophie, I can't believe you're Eddie Harrison's granddaughter. That man is the reason I got to meet my wife, raise my children, and live the life I've had for the past 56 years. Not a day goes by that I don't think about what he did for us. He should have gotten the Medal of Honor right away, but something about the operation being classified kept it quiet for decades. Is he doing well? I've tried to find him over the years, but never had any luck." The email continued with Torres's phone number and a request to pass along his contact information to her grandfather. "I'd love to thank him personally," Torres wrote. "He probably doesn't remember, but he carried me almost half a mile through the jungle after I got hit. I was unconscious for most of it, but the medic said he refused to leave me behind, even when it would have been easier and safer." Sophie printed out all the statements and emails, creating a folder of documentation that painted a picture of her grandfather she'd never imagined. This wasn't just a man who'd served in Vietnam. This was someone who'd performed actions so heroic they'd become legend among the men who'd witnessed them. She researched the rarity of the Congressional Medal of Honor, learning that most recipients were celebrated for life, that they received special recognition wherever they went, that their stories were told and retold as examples of American heroism at its finest. Yet her grandfather had been forced to keep his award secret for 50 years, carrying the burden of his heroism alone. The psychological impact of that secrecy began to make sense to Sophie. Imagine earning the highest honor your country could bestow, then being told you could never speak of it, never share it with your family, never receive the recognition that every other Medal of Honor recipient enjoyed. The isolation must have been unbearable. Sophie also found records of her grandfather's involvement in other military actions, operations that had been classified for decades, but were now public knowledge. He'd been part of long-range reconnaissance missions, special operations that required soldiers with exceptional skills and courage. The man she'd dismissed as boring had lived through experiences that were literally the stuff of military legend. By dawn, Sophie had assembled a complete picture of Edward Harrison's military service. She had official documents, witness statements, historical context, and contact information for men who still considered her grandfather a hero. She had everything she needed for her school project and so much more. But more importantly, she finally understood who her grandfather really was, and she was ashamed of who she'd been to him. Sophie couldn't wait until morning. At 6 a.m. she burst into her parents' bedroom, clutching the folder of documents she'd printed through the night. Marcus and Rebecca jolted awake, expecting an emergency. "Mom, Dad, you have to see this," Sophie said, her voice shaking with excitement and emotion. "It's about Grandpa. You're not going to believe what I found." Rebecca sat up, immediately alert. "Sophie, what's wrong? Is your grandfather okay?" "He's more than okay," Sophie said, spreading the documents across their bed. "Dad, did you know Grandpa has the Congressional Medal of Honor? Did you know he's literally one of the most decorated soldiers in American history?" Marcus rubbed his eyes, looking confused. "Sophie, what are you talking about? Your grandfather served in Vietnam, but he never—" "Look at this." Sophie thrust the official citation into her father's hands. "Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded in 1975, but classified until last year. Dad, this is the highest military honor in the country. There are only like 258 people from Vietnam who have this medal. Marcus took the document, his expression changing as he read. Rebecca leaned over his shoulder, both of them silent as they absorbed the formal military language describing Edward's heroic actions. The room was quiet, except for the sound of pages turning as they read through witness statements and official records. "This can't be right," Marcus said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad would have told us. He would have mentioned something this important." Sophie pulled out her laptop and showed them the government database where she'd found the information. "It was classified, Dad. For almost 50 years he wasn't allowed to tell anyone. Look at the declassification date, March 2023. He's only been legally able to talk about it for a year." Rebecca was reading one of the witness statements, tears forming in her eyes. "Marcus, listen to this. This soldier says your father saved 12 men's lives. He carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire. He led a counterattack against overwhelming odds." Jake appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "What's everyone yelling about?" "Your grandfather is a war hero," Sophie said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and shame. "A real one. Not just someone who served, someone who did something so brave they gave him the medal they reserve for the most incredible acts of courage." Marcus was staring at his father's medical records, seeing for the first time the extent of his combat injuries and trauma. He was wounded 3 times. "Look at this. Bullet wound to the left shoulder. Shrapnel wounds to the right thigh. Combat stress reaction requiring extended treatment. Why didn't he ever tell us how badly he was hurt?" The family spent the next hour going through Sophie's research, passing documents back and forth, each revelation adding to their growing sense of shock and shame. The man they'd dismissed as a sad old veteran with boring stories was revealed to be someone extraordinary, someone whose actions had literally saved lives and earned the respect of the United States military at the highest levels. Rebecca was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "Oh my God, Marcus, all these years, we've treated him like he was just your elderly father taking up space. And he's been carrying this secret, knowing what he did, knowing how important it was, and unable to share it with anyone." Jake, now fully awake and engaged, was reading the witness statements with wide eyes. "Grandpa did all this, actually did this stuff? This sounds like a movie." "It's not a movie," Sophie said quietly. "It's real. And I've been calling him boring for years. We all have." Marcus stood up abruptly and started pacing. "I need to talk to him, right now. I need to understand why he never said anything, even after it was declassified." "Marcus, wait," Rebecca said. "Think about this from his perspective. He's been forced to keep quiet about the most important thing he's ever done for 50 years. Then when he's finally allowed to talk about it, we've already established a pattern of dismissing his war stories. Maybe he tried to tell us, and we didn't listen." The realization hit them all simultaneously. How many times had Edward started to share a memory from Vietnam, only to be interrupted, dismissed, or ignored? How many times had they changed the subject when he began talking about his service? How many opportunities had they missed to learn about his extraordinary heroism because they'd already decided his stories weren't worth hearing? Sophie started crying. "I wrote an essay about him in 7th grade called My Boring Grandfather. I actually used the word boring to describe a man who has the Congressional Medal of Honor. What kind of person does that make me?" Marcus sat back down, the weight of their collective failure settling over him. "It makes you human, Sophie. It makes all of us human. We made assumptions based on what we could see, and we couldn't see past our own prejudices about aging and trauma and what heroism looks like." Rebecca was rereading the citation, shaking her head in amazement. 12 men went home to their families because of what your father did. 12 men got to live full lives, have children, grow old because he was willing to risk everything for them, and we've been treating him like a burden. The conversation continued for another hour, the family grappling with the enormous disconnect between who they thought Edward was and who he actually was. They made plans to approach him carefully, to apologize sincerely, and to finally give him the recognition and respect he deserved. But first, they had to figure out how to look him in the eye. And knowing what they now knew about their own blindness and ingratitude, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my morning coffee when the whole family approached me. Something was different. Their faces were serious, almost solemn, and Sophie was carrying a folder that looked thick with documents. My first thought was that someone was sick or that there was bad news about finances or family matters. "Grandpa," Sophie said, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years, "we need to talk to you about something important." Marcus pulled out a chair across from me, and Rebecca sat down beside him. Jake, normally glued to his phone, was actually paying attention. The formality of it all made me nervous. "Dad," Marcus began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "Sophie found something while doing research for her school project, something about your service in Vietnam." My heart started pounding. After 50 years of secrecy, after decades of keeping the most important moment of my life locked away, I had a feeling I knew what was coming. Sophie opened her folder and pulled out a document I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in years. The official Congressional Medal of Honor citation with the presidential seal at the top and my name in formal military typography. "Grandpa," Sophie said, her eyes filling with tears, "why didn't you tell us?" I stared at the document, my hands trembling slightly. After all these years of hiding, of carrying this secret alone, of watching my family dismiss my service as unremarkable, the truth was finally out. But instead of relief, I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a part of me that I'd protected for decades was suddenly naked under bright lights. "I couldn't," I said quietly. "It was classified. I wasn't allowed to discuss it with anyone who didn't have security clearance." Marcus leaned forward. "But Dad, it was declassified over a year ago. You could have told us then." I looked around. The table at their faces, Sophie's shame, Marcus's confusion, Rebecca's tears, Jake's wide-eyed amazement. How could I explain what it felt like to carry a secret for so long that it becomes part of you? How could I tell them that after years of being dismissed and ignored, I'd lost the courage to share, even when I was finally allowed to? "By the time I was permitted to talk about it," I said slowly, "I didn't know how to bring it up. You'd all made it clear that my war stories were boring, that my service wasn't worth discussing. I tried to tell you about Vietnam so many times over the years, but nobody wanted to listen." Sophie started crying openly. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry. I called you boring. I rolled my eyes at your stories. I had no idea that you were trying to share something this important." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You couldn't have known, sweetheart. The classification order was very specific. I wasn't allowed to discuss the circumstances of the award, the mission, or even the fact that I'd received it. For 50 years I had to pretend it never happened." Rebecca spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "Edward, we found the witness. Statements from the men you saved. 12 soldiers went home to their families because of what you did. You're a genuine American hero, and we've been treating you like an old man with nothing important to say." I finished for her. "I know. I felt it every day." Marcus was studying the citation, shaking his head in amazement. "Dad, this describes actions that are almost unbelievable. You single-handedly drew enemy fire to save wounded men, then led a counterattack against superior forces. This is the kind of thing they make movies about." "It wasn't like a movie," I said. "It was terrifying." I was 23 years old, responsible for 12 other young men, and I made a decision in the space of seconds that I've been living with ever since. I didn't feel heroic. I felt desperate. Jake, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "Grandpa, you never told us any of this stuff. All your stories were about your buddies and places you went. You never said you saved people's lives." I smiled at him, remembering all the times I'd tried to share memories only to see him check his phone or leave the room. I tried to tell you about the important things, Jake, but the really important things were classified, and the other stories, well, they seemed to bore everyone. We're idiots, Sophie said bluntly. We're complete idiots. You've been trying to share your experiences with us, and we've been treating you like you were just some old guy rambling about ancient history. You're not idiots, I said firmly. You're young people living in a different world, dealing with different challenges. What happened to me in Vietnam was a long time ago. I understand why it seemed irrelevant to your lives. But Marcus was reading through more of the documents, and his expression was changing. Dad, there's something else here. Financial records showing that you used your veteran benefits and disability payments to help pay for my education. All those years when I thought you were just scraping by on construction work. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. That was between me and the bills, son. You paid for Harvard Law School with money you got for being wounded in combat, Marcus said, his voice breaking. You've been supporting this family for decades with benefits you earned by bleeding for your country, and I thought you were just barely getting by. The conversation continued for 2 hours. They asked questions I'd been waiting 50 years to answer. They listened to stories they'd dismissed before, but now they heard them with new ears, understanding that the boring old man had actually lived through experiences that most people could never imagine. For the first time in decades, I felt seen by my own family. The secret that had isolated me for so long was finally shared, and the burden I'd carried alone was finally acknowledged by the people who mattered most. The classification had ended, but more importantly, so had my invisibility. The apologies came in different forms over the following days, each family member needing to process their newfound understanding in their own way. But it was Sophie who surprised me most with the depth of her remorse and the sincerity of her effort to make amends. She appeared at my bedroom door the morning after our revelation, holding a handwritten letter that was several pages long. "Grandpa, I wrote this for you. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know how I feel." The letter was extraordinary in its honesty and maturity. She wrote about her shame, her ignorance, and her deep regret for the years she dismissed me as irrelevant. But what moved me most was her recognition of the pain I must have felt. I can't imagine how lonely it must have been to carry such an important secret for so long, especially when your own family was treating your service like it didn't matter. I'm sorry I wasn't smart enough or mature enough to see past my own teenage selfishness to recognize the man you really are. Jake's apology was more direct, but equally heartfelt. He found me in the living room that evening and sat down beside me, something he hadn't done voluntarily in years. "Grandpa, I've been a jerk to you, like a really big jerk. I'm sorry I always acted like your stories were stupid. I'm sorry I made you feel like you didn't matter." Then he asked me something that nearly brought me to tears. "Would you tell me about Tommy Rodriguez? Like, really tell me. I want to know about your friend who died." For the first time in years, I shared the story of Rodriguez without interruption, without eye rolls, without feeling like I was boring my audience. Jake listened intently as I described Tommy's dream of becoming a teacher, his sense of humor that kept us all sane, and the senseless way he died stepping on a mine while trying to help a wounded Vietnamese child. When I finished, Jake was quiet for a long moment. "He was only 19, Jake asked. 19 years old, just a few years older than you are now. That's really heavy, Grandpa. I'm sorry he died, and I'm sorry I never listened before." Marcus's apology was the most difficult to hear because it came with the weight of decades of misunderstanding. He approached me in my room one evening holding his own handwritten letter, and his eyes were red from crying. "Dad, I've been a terrible son," he began, his voice breaking. "All these years I thought I was the successful one, the one who made something of himself, while you were just struggling to get by. I had no idea that you were funding my success with money you earned through your own sacrifice and heroism." His letter detailed specific memories, Times when I'd tried to connect with him, moments when I'd offered advice or support that he'd dismissed because he thought I didn't understand his sophisticated world. He wrote about the guilt he felt, knowing that his Harvard education, his law career, his comfortable life had all been built on a foundation of my hidden sacrifice. "I used to be embarrassed by you," he admitted, the words clearly painful to say. "When Rebecca's family would ask about my father, I'd just say, 'You worked construction,' and change the subject. I thought you were ordinary. I'm ashamed of who I was and how I treated you." Rebecca's apology came with action. She spent days researching Medal of Honor recipients and their families, learning about the honor and recognition that should have been part of my life for decades. She made a photo album with copies of my citation, the witness statements, and historical information about my unit and our actions in Vietnam. "Edward, I want you to know that I understand now why you seem distant sometimes, why certain things triggered difficult reactions. I'm sorry I didn't recognize the signs of what you were dealing with. I'm sorry we made you feel like a burden instead of the hero you are. But it was the collective apology that meant the most to me." The family gathered in the living room one evening, and Marcus spoke for all of them. "Dad, we want you to know that we understand now. We understand that you've been carrying an incredible burden alone, and we're sorry we weren't worthy of your trust. We're sorry we made you feel invisible in your own family." They asked me to tell them everything, not just about the Medal of Honor action, but about my entire military experience. For the first time in decades, I had an audience that truly wanted to hear my stories. I talked about basic training, about the friends I'd made and lost, about the fear and camaraderie and impossible decisions that defined those years. Sophie took notes during these conversations, creating a family history that had been missing for too long. She compiled photos, documents, and my stories into a comprehensive record of my service. "I want Jake's kids to know about their great-grandfather," she said. "I want this story to be told." They also made practical changes. Marcus moved my bedroom to the main floor's den, giving me more space and privacy. Rebecca framed my citation and hung it in the living room, replacing the prominent display of Marcus's law degree with recognition of my Medal of Honor. They asked about my old military friends and helped me reconnect with some of the men I'd served with. Most importantly, they started asking for my advice and opinions on important matters. They included me in family decisions, sought my perspective on their challenges, and treated me like the patriarch I'd always been, but never felt like. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, but it was real. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged in my own family, like my experiences mattered, like my voice was worth hearing. The secret that had isolated me for 50 years had finally become the bridge that connected me to the people I loved most. Sophie's history, the project, became something far more significant than a school assignment. After spending weeks researching and interviewing me, she'd created a comprehensive presentation about not just my actions in Vietnam, but about the broader issue of classified military honors and the veterans who'd been forced to carry their heroism in silence. Her teacher, Mrs. Peterson, was so impressed with the project that she recommended Sophie for the state history competition. But more importantly, she contacted the local newspaper about the story. "This is exactly the kind of local history that people need to know about," she told Sophie. "Your grandfather's story shouldn't be limited to a classroom presentation." The reporter who came to interview me was a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, probably close to Sophie's age, who approached the story with the seriousness and respect it deserved. She'd done her homework, researching not just my service record, but the broader context of classified military operations during Vietnam. "Mr. Harrison," she said, setting up her recording equipment in our living room, "can you tell me what it was like to receive the Medal of Honor in secret? What was it like to be unable to share this honor with your family?" It was the first time anyone outside my family had asked me that question, and I found myself struggling with the emotion of it. Imagine achieving the most important thing you'll ever do in your life, and then being told you can never speak of it. Imagine watching your family dismiss your service as unremarkable when you know you've done something extraordinary. It was like living two lives. The public life where I was just another struggling veteran, and the private life where I carried this incredible secret. The article that resulted was front-page news in our local paper. The headline read, "Hidden, Hero Among Us, Local Veteran's Secret Medal of Honor Finally Revealed." Jennifer had done an exceptional job of explaining not just what I'd done, but why it had been classified and what that secrecy had cost me and my family over the decades. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper received dozens of calls and emails from readers who wanted to express their gratitude and support. Veterans organizations reached out to invite me to speak at their events. The local VFW Post, which I'd never joined because I'd felt too damaged and different from other veterans, called to offer me an honorary membership. But the most meaningful response came from unexpected sources. Michael Torres, one of the men I'd saved in Vietnam, drove 8 hours from Ohio to visit me after seeing the article online. He was 74 years old now, with grandchildren of his own, and he wept when he saw me for the first time in over 50 years. "Eddie," he said, using the nickname only my military buddies had ever used, "I've been looking for you for decades. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. You gave me my life back." He brought photos of his family, his wife of 48 years, his 3 children, his 7 grandchildren. "None of this would exist without you," he said. "My whole family line, everything I've built, everyone I've loved, it all started with you deciding to save my life in that jungle." 2 other survivors from that day contacted me through the newspaper. David Kim, now a retired engineer living in California, flew out to meet me. Jimmy Patterson, who'd become a high school principal in Texas, called to invite me to speak at his school's Veterans Day assembly. The local recognition led to broader attention. The State Veterans Affairs Office reached out to discuss whether I'd be interested in participating in official Medal of Honor ceremonies and events. The Congressional Medal of Honor Society, which I'd never known existed, contacted me about joining their organization. For the first time in my life, I was receiving the recognition that Medal of Honor recipients typically enjoy. People approached me in stores to shake my hand and thank me for my service. Restaurants offered me free meals. The local car dealership gave me a discount for a genuine American hero, as the manager put it. But the most significant recognition came from my own community. The city council voted to name a small park in my honor, and the dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including many veterans who'd never had their own service properly recognized. Sophie gave a speech at the dedication that brought the entire crowd to tears. She talked about the importance of recognizing our veterans while they're still alive, about the danger of dismissing older people's experiences as irrelevant, and about the lessons she'd learned about looking deeper than surface appearances. "My grandfather taught me that heroism doesn't always look like what we expect," she said. "Sometimes it looks like a quiet old man who's been carrying incredible stories inside him, waiting for someone to care enough to listen." The local high school invited me to speak to their history classes, and I found myself sharing my experiences with young people who hung on every word. These teenagers, the same age as my grandchildren, treated me with a respect and attention I'd rarely experienced from my own family. One student asked me a question that stayed with me. "Mr. Harrison, do you think there are other veterans in our community who have stories like yours that we don't know about?" The answer, of course, was yes. My story had opened a door to recognizing that many veterans, particularly those from Vietnam, had carried their service in silence, either because of classification issues or because they'd returned to a country that didn't welcome them home with parades and celebration. The newspaper article and subsequent recognition had done more than just honor my service. It had started a conversation about how we treat our veterans and how we value the experiences of older people in our communities. For the first time in my life, my story was being used to help others, and that felt like the most meaningful recognition of all. 6 months after Sophie discovered my secret, our family took a new photograph. This time, I wasn't sitting alone. On the periphery, while everyone gathered around Marcus, I was in the center, surrounded by family members who finally understood who I was and what I'd done with my life. The difference in that photograph captures everything that changed during those months. My posture is straighter, my smile is genuine, and my eyes have a light that had been missing for years. Sophie and Jake are pressed close to me on either side, no longer embarrassed by their grandfather, but proud to be associated with me. Marcus has his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of respect and love that had been absent for decades. But the changes went deeper than photographs could capture. Our dinner table conversations now included me as an equal participant rather than someone to be politely tolerated. When Marcus talked about difficult cases at work, he asked for my perspective, recognizing that someone who'd made life and death decisions under extreme pressure might have valuable insights to offer. Sophie started a tradition of grandpas stories every Sunday evening when she'd ask me to share a memory from my military service or my life with Margaret. But now she listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions, taking notes for the family history she was compiling. These weren't the boring war stories she'd once dismissed. They were treasured family memories being preserved for future generations. Jake joined the school's history club and gave a presentation about my Medal of Honor, earning recognition from his teachers and classmates. He'd gone from being embarrassed by his grandfather to being proud to share my story with his peers. More importantly, he started coming to me with problems and questions, treating me like the experienced adult I'd always been, but had never been allowed to be in his life. Rebecca made sure I had proper medical care for the first time in years, finding specialists who understood combat trauma and helping me address physical problems I'd been ignoring. She also helped me reconnect with military friends I'd lost touch with over the decades, rebuilding relationships that had been important to me but had faded due to isolation and shame. The broader recognition in our community led to opportunities I'd never expected. I became involved with local veterans organizations, not as someone seeking help, but as someone with experience and wisdom to offer. Young veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan sought me out for advice and support, and I found purpose in helping them navigate the challenges of civilian readjustment. I started speaking at schools and community events, sharing not just my war experiences, but the broader lessons about resilience, duty, and the importance of recognizing heroism in unexpected places. These speaking engagements gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing since my retirement from construction work. The Congressional Medal of Honor Society welcomed me as a member, and I attended my first annual convention, meeting other recipients who'd had similar experiences with classification and secrecy. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who truly understood what I'd been through, both in combat and in the decades of silence that followed. But the most meaningful change was the simple fact that I was no longer invisible. In my own family, when I spoke, people listened. When I offered advice, it was considered. When I shared memories, they were treasured rather than tolerated. Margaret's death had left me feeling like my story was over, like the important chapters of my life were behind me. But the revelation of my Medal of Honor and my family's changed. Perspective had given me a new chapter, a chance to be valued and respected in my final years. Sophie graduated high school with honors and chose to study history in college, inspired partly by her research into my military service. She credited our story with teaching her about the importance of looking deeper than surface appearances and never dismissing people based on age or assumptions. Marcus and I developed a relationship built on mutual respect rather than dutiful obligation. He started asking about my experiences not just in the military, but throughout my life, recognizing that his father had accumulated 7 decades of wisdom that might be valuable to his own challenges and decisions. The park dedication had included the planting of 12 oak trees, one for each soldier whose life I'd saved in Vietnam. Watching those young trees take root became a metaphor for how I felt about this new phase of my life. After decades of feeling withered and forgotten, I was growing again. On quiet evenings, I sit in that park sometimes, reading the plaque that bears my name and describes my actions in Vietnam. Children play on the equipment nearby, their laughter echoing through the trees that represent lives saved and families preserved. It's a sound that fills me with peace and purpose. The secret that had isolated me for 50 years had become the foundation for meaningful connections, not just with my family, but with my community and with veterans who needed to know that their service mattered. My story had become bigger than just my own experience. It had become a bridge connecting generations and honoring all the veterans whose heroism had gone unrecognized for too long. At 74, I finally understood what it meant to be truly seen, truly valued, and truly home. The war had ended decades ago, but my service to others continued, and that service gave my life meaning that went far beyond the medal hidden in my dresser drawer for so many years. The boy who'd been drafted at 22 had become a man whose story could inspire others to look more carefully at the people around them, to listen more closely to the stories being shared, and to recognize that heroism often wears ordinary clothes and sits quietly at kitchen tables, waiting patiently for someone to care enough to ask the right questions.